the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday evening, where the Dow has gone down 7.7%, S&P 500 down 7.7%, the biggest drop since December 2008, and the 11th biggest drop in American history. Most of those big drops happened during the Great Depression, or 1929 and the years that followed that. But in modern times, maybe the second largest drop of the stock exchange ever. And of course, that's just one day. It's been a disaster if you're long stocks. All because of the coronavirus. And I know, I'm sick of reading about the coronavirus, hearing about the coronavirus, talking about the coronavirus. And I don't know, you might be sick of hearing me talk about the coronavirus. So I will, but it's I open up the news and it's all anybody is talking about. It's all what anybody's on their mind. And I figure there's still quite a bit to say about it. Every day gives new content to be able to talk about. And the stock market, of course, declining today is part of that. Oil prices, I don't know if you've seen oil prices going down dramatically. We'll talk about that, why they went down, and what are the geopolitical consequences of the plunge in oil prices, which partially, by the way, led to the stock market declining. And, of course, we'll talk about coronavirus. The country of Italy, 60 million people is under lockdown. Now, you can kind of imagine that in China, but we're talking about Italy, a supposedly free country. And now the government has locked everybody down. You're supposed to be home. You can go to work. You can get essentials. But other than that, you can't congregate, you can't go to movies, you can't go shopping. You have to stay home in a free country. If not, what are they going to do to you? I guess they theoretically could arrest you. I'm not sure what exactly they would do to you. But it is truly nutty, horrific, and a massive violation of personal freedom and individual rights, and we'll get to that. Luca mentions a great lecture by Amesh Adalja, who I've had on the show about the coronavirus topic. He's done a number of things. There's a great lecture. I recommended it a few days ago. I recommended this lecture that he did at Carnegie Mellon University. It's very good. Look it up on YouTube. I think I put the link under one of my previous shows, and it just puts the coronavirus into perspective, right? Into perspective, right? So I encourage you to watch that. Also, I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago. I know he's been interviewed on Harry Binswanger's HB list, which I recommend, and I think he's doing something else with Greg Salamieri any day now. So, Amesh is a really, really, really good source on this stuff, and and it's things are getting out of control. Things are getting out of control, and I think the stock market is just a reflection of the insanity, the voluntary insanity, and the kind of coerced insanity that is going on in the world around us over this coronavirus. So we talked about it before. The coronavirus is deadly if you're over 80, particularly if you have respiratory illness, if you smoked a lot, if you have weak lungs, or if you have any kind of respiratory disease. It truly is deadly. Mortality rates are quite high for if you're over 80 and you get this disease. And even if you're over 70 and you're not in great health, it is quite deadly and it is quite dangerous for pretty much everybody else who is healthy, including children, by the way, which is surprising, including very young children, infants. The coronavirus is like getting a cold or a flu. Some people might need to be hospitalized and be on an IV, but for most people, 80+% of people, probably 90% of people under the age of 70, certainly under the age of 60, it is no big deal. And yet, people are not traveling. People are being quarantined by force. I know, one of, people say, Iran, are you still traveling? I say, yeah. The real fear I have traveling is not getting the virus. I'm guessing, I will get it at some point. The real fear I have in traveling is that I land inside an airport and they quarantine me for 2 weeks for some bizarre reason. Israel, for example, has just announced that anybody coming into the country from a different country, which is pretty much anybody coming into the country, is going to be quarantined in Israel for 14 days. Now, I have a trip planned to Israel in May, but if they're going to quarantine me for 14 days, I'm not going. So I'm going to travel less, not because of the virus, not because of the illness, not because of the consequence of that, but because of what they will do to me. Now, note, it is true that if you have parents who are in their 80s, or if you have friends in their 80s, or if you have, you just care for people in their 80s, you're around them or whatever, then you need to be careful. And I would suggest helping those people self-isolate, those people, if you're over 80, particularly if you have any kind of respiratory illness, it makes sense for you to stay home. It makes sense for you to have groceries delivered and find a way to interact as little as possible with other people. It makes sense for you to be tested if you don't feel well. I mean, if you interact with people who are over 80 and you care for those people, then you need to be careful. I don't, certainly not currently. My parents are over 80, and I would worry if I was seeing them on a regular basis while I'm traveling like crazy and couldn't be tested. But other than that, what is the danger here? What is the fear? I mean, every single state, not every single state, many states now have announced states of emergency, whether they have many cases or not. States of emergency basically give those states huge powers over people. We had the mayor of Austin basically telling South by Southwest. South by Southwest is this massive music festival, right? Massive music festival that hundreds of thousands of people come to. And many businesses in Austin are dependent on it economically. We had the mayor of Austin, Texas, basically tell them that they need to shut down the festival. It wasn't South by Southwest who made the call. It was the mayor of Austin who made the call. It is, talk about authoritarianism. Now, again, there is a legitimate question, and I want to bring this up. There is a legitimate question of what the role of government during an epidemic is. But the epidemic, the role of government is not to prevent you from getting a disease. Unless that disease is life debilitating or destroying. And unless there is a high probability of that happening. So certainly there are certain diseases. Measles is incredibly, you can get it very, very easily. And there are many other diseases that are hugely communicative. And Ebola kills so many people, pretty much anybody who gets it. I don't know, 35% of people who get it, 50% of people who get it die. And you can see a role of government in monitoring, in screening, and in isolating people under those kind of conditions. But even Ebola is very hard to get from person to person. See, even there, for the most part, government, when we had an Ebola scare a few years ago, government overreacted to it. So there's a legitimate question, and you need real experts both in legal philosophy and legal theory and medical experts to come together and kind of figure out what would be an appropriate regime, an appropriate methodology under which the government could use its coercive powers in order to protect us from, diseases, communicable diseases that truly, somebody walking around with that disease would be an infringement on the rights of other people. But we would have to be very clear about what kind of disease that is, when that was applied, under what circumstances, how deadly would it have to be? So I don't claim to have the answer for that. But clearly, coronavirus, where the mortality rate is probably less than 1%, probably quite a bit less than 1%, is not a situation in which the government, it is appropriate for the government to use its coercive force to shut people down, to force them into their homes. And, Lucas says one of the sad things about all that, and it's true, is that at least Italians are embracing it. They're kind of giving in to authoritarian government, telling them what they can and cannot do with their lives, who they can and cannot mingle with, when they can and cannot leave their homes, for what they can and cannot leave their homes. Coronavirus is not a deadly virus. There is no evidence of that. Don't believe the videos on YouTube. Don't believe all the fake news that is coming out about this virus. It is bad, again, for a certain group of people, and those people need to be really, really careful. And you, if you suspect you might have been exposed, should be really, really careful interacting with those people. But other than that, it truly is like a cold or a flu, and a lot less deadly in terms of the numbers of people who get it. Now, it's true, coronavirus kills more people than the flu does, primarily elderly people. The flu kills more children. The flu kills more children. The real, I think, danger that the coronavirus poses, and this is where all the energy should be focused on, is that it could really tax our hospitals. It could really tax medical professionals in terms of if this got really widespread and a lot of people were sick, a small percentage of them would need hospitalization, but a small percentage of a very large number could wipe out all the free beds in hospitals. So the focus should be, the focus of our efforts, and since government is involved in healthcare, the focus of government, because it is involved in this, it spends money on this. But the focus of hospitals, the focus of medical professions should be on two things, on testing and on hospital beds and hospital supplies. So hospital beds and supplies, that should be where the energy goes into. Making sure there are enough beds, making sure that the hospitals are equipped, that they have supplies. And then beyond that, making sure that we can get tested. Now, supposedly, starting next week, there'll be testing available, all over the place. Quest and some of the diagnostic companies have developed or acquired tests, and they will be providing testing. So hopefully by next week, we'll get to the point where we should have been 3 weeks ago, because it seemed like the United States, by stopping those airlines flying in from China, which was way overreaction and the wrong thing to do at the time. Again, violating individual rights for what? There's a point in which stopping people from coming is not violation of rights because you're using it in protection, but what are you protecting people from in this case? Instead, they should have focused on developing testing and again, getting the medical supplies and everything else up to snuff, but the priorities are all wrong. The optics are all different. The political optics are all different in terms of how you can talk about here. And here, by the way, both left and right are wrong. I mean, the Democrats are politicizing this and making and upping the hysteria about it. And Donald Trump, for the most part, is dismissing it, overly dismissing it, and constantly contradicting his scientists. Now, the scientists, the CDC, seems to be overreacting to this in a way that they haven't in past epidemics that are similar to this. But then if you look at the world, you look at what China did, you look at what Italy is doing, and people are just thinking, well, that's what governments are for. They're there to take care of me. They're doing something. Them doing something is better than nothing. And it's across the board. It just really is. We're going to go into economic crisis here. I mean, the stock market is clearly indicating a significant recession. And, in my view, many of our business leaders are reacting badly to the coronavirus. But we're going to go into recession, not so much because of the coronavirus, but because of a political response to the coronavirus at the local level, at the federal level, and at the business level. Instead of, again, just focusing on those who are really sick and dealing with them and trying to shield people who are particularly sensitive and have a high likelihood of really suffering from this disease. Instead of shielding them, we're trying to protect everybody, which is impossible to do. So all that will happen is the virus will grow in the United States, but it will grow slowly. The bad news will, trickle out there, and as it trickles out there, people will become more and more and more panicked because they won't know. There's no adult in the room. There's literally no adult in the room. You can sit down, face the American people, and give them the facts, the actual facts, without playing politics. Admit that we screwed up on testing. But on the other hand, say, look, this is not a crisis. And if you feel like you've got cold or flu symptoms, stay home. That's what you should probably do if you've got flu or cold anyway. But suddenly under these conditions, stay home. If you're going to interact with 80-year-olds or 70-year-olds, don't do it if you're worried about having symptoms, if you're worried about being exposed to the virus. Just some common sense stuff, just backed by real science. Should have allowed testing labs to test weeks ago, and this is not. I've heard a rumor that this is because China didn't release the sequence, the genetic sequence of the virus, and that's why we didn't have testing. That's just plain fake news. The fact is that the WHO had testing kits way earlier. And those testing kits were based on China providing the genome, and its testing kits work fine. And it's the United States that turned down those testing kits and built defective ones. Now we're starting to let labs produce their own testing kits, and we're getting a boom in the amount of testing that will be available to Americans in the weeks and months to come because we've unleashed the private sector, the non-governmental sector, on actually creating these testing kits. So again, while the government has some role to play, the less deadly the disease is, the less role the government has to play. And governments all over the world, primarily now in China and in Italy, have way overreacted. And our government, on a local basis, some governments are way overreacting. Certainly Austin way overreacted by canceling South by Southwest. I think some of the advice given to cancel conferences and so on is wrong and flawed and not objective. But again, I think the advice the CDC gave this morning, saying, if you're 80 years old, don't travel. If you're 80 years old, don't go to where there are lots of places. That all makes sense. That's all stuff people should follow. So again, having that right balance. And the media is nuts, left and right and middle and everywhere, across the entire media. I know it's clickbait to be constantly obsessed with hysteria, to overblow stories, to overfocus on the negatives, and the way they present Italy, it's like with praise. Look, finally a government that does something. As if government is always the solution, and certainly government authoritarianism is always the solution to these kind of problems. It is not. It is not. Yeah, facts and common sense, common sense is the wrong way. Facts and reason, a reasoned approach, a reasoned presentation of what is going on. So what is instead happening? We're getting panic, we're getting hysteria across the board, from private individuals who are buying up toilet paper at Costco for some bizarre reason. I have no idea what toilet paper has to do with coronavirus. And why, of all the products out there, toilet paper is the one thing that people are worried about running out of. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something. But as far as I know, corona doesn't cause diarrhea. But that's not one of the symptoms. So I'm not sure what's going on. I kind of understand, cleansers and stuff like that. I can understand. Toilet paper, I just don't get. But that's what's going on. Companies across the board are telling people not to go to work. I think probably a mistake. I don't think it's going to help that much. I think what it's going to do is lower productivity. I think what it's going to do is cause real economic harm. And I don't think you're saving anybody anything. Again, if you're sick, certainly if you've got the snivels, if you've got a cold, if you've got the flu, or if you already have some kind of respiratory disease, weakness, illness, stay home. Don't go anywhere. If you're over 70 years old, don't stay home. Don't go anywhere. But the idea that we should all stop working and stay at home and not go to work, I think, again, is wrong, and it's creating real economic stress. And again, there's no adult in the room. There's no adult in the room to sit down and convey that message. Right? Everybody is panicking. And of course, it's the panic. It's the authoritarian kind of restrictions. It's shutting down South by Southwest and many other conferences and events. It's what China did to its economy. It's what the United States, the risk the United States poses now to its own economy, to airlines and to cruise ships. But across the board, the entire supply chain is now at risk. And the uncertainty and the fear, and that is what is causing markets to completely lose it, to go nuts, and to now predict almost for certain a recession. Because the fact is that if people stay home, if people don't go to work, if people don't produce, if people don't make the effort that they do on a day-to-day basis to produce and to create and to make and to feed the supply chain and to make sure the supply chain of products is a continuing basis within the United States, outside of the United States. If all of that, if people neglect that, then supply will collapse, and as a consequence, demand will collapse, and the economy will collapse with it. And of course, the second aspect of this is that we are now trusting politicians in terms of the response to this. So now we expect politicians to solve all of our problems. We expect economists at the Federal Reserve or at the Treasury Department or to not allow us ever to go into recession, that there's a shock like the coronavirus, and our politicians need to bail us out almost immediately. So a lot of what is going on right now in the stock market, we'll get to oil in a minute, is purely a response to the fact that what are the politicians going to do? What are they going to impose on us? I mean, we saw the interest rate cut that the Fed instigated a few days ago, and the market crashed as a consequence. I mean, is really lowering interest rates more the solution to the coronavirus and to the possible economic slowdown of the coronavirus? Really? Maybe some stability from our politicians and from our managers, our central planners in chief at the Fed and in our government halls. Maybe that would help a little bit. Maybe some stability. Maybe some sense that the government is going to say, we don't think, we're going to leave this alone. We're going to leave the economy alone. We think you can handle it. Instead of immediately rushing for bailouts and solutions. We've already got an $8.3 billion spending package that Trump signed to deal with coronavirus. Really? Is that what we need? I mean, I can understand if that was mainly, right, for vaccines and for medical equipment and stuff like that. But it's not. It's filled with pork. It's filled with BS. And a lot of it is to support states that are battling the outbreak. What does that even mean? That means financially support them. That means throw money away into the hands of politicians at the state level. These crises turn out to be excuses for growing government, excuses for more government intervention, excuses for the government to intervene more and to control more in the economy. So we've got the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates. We've got President Trump now promising, oh, maybe we'll do a payroll tax cut. Not because of any economic theory that says this is a good thing generally to do, but we've got a crisis, we have to do something. Now, I'm all for tax cuts, almost any time. There's also serious talk about bailouts. They're talking about a bailout of the airlines. The airlines are just waiting. The airlines basically got their hand out, and they're just waiting for the bailout. They don't, why focus on trying to maximize profitability in situations like this when government's going to bail us out anyway? Why worry? Be happy. Cruise ship bailouts, travel industry bailouts. We're going to have bailouts left and right over this because, God forbid, you allow a business to go bankrupt. God forbid you don't let the economy adjust to shocks like coronavirus. No. We need a central planner in chief to control this, to monitor this, to make sure exactly we respond right and that the economy doesn't grow too much and doesn't slow too much and doesn't have a recession and unemployment is just the right level. We're obsessed with central planning. Indeed, overnight, just last night, the Federal Reserve increased its cash injections into the economy. Note, increased. The Federal Reserve on average injects into the economy. It also sucks out of the economy, but it's manipulating money on a daily basis at the tune of $100 billion. $100 billion. I mean, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. That's almost all of the wealth that Bill Gates and what's his name at Amazon have, right? $100 billion. Well, last night they did 150 for good measure. And the stock market still went down 7.7%, maybe because stock market knows that these guys have no clue what they're doing. That all these economic gurus at the Federal Reserve or at the federal government have no clue what is going on. $150 billion were injected overnight, slushing around. And then, of course, you've got oil prices. Now, oil prices, the demand for oil was coming down because the world economy was going to slow. Whether it was going to go into recession or not was a good question, hard to tell, but it certainly was going to slow down because of the coronavirus, because of the way China responded to it, or maybe that would have happened anyway, no matter how China would have responded to corona, no matter how the U.S. would have responded to corona, maybe the world would have slowed down anyway. But the global economy was going to slow down, and therefore demand for oil was going to slow down. So OPEC plus is OPEC plus non-OPEC countries like Russia, got together and said, okay, we're going to try to cut supply so that even though demand shrinks, prices don't move. And the Saudis and the Russians got into a fight over how much to cut. And the Russians basically walked away saying, no deal. We're not cutting our production. We're not going to play game. We're not going to play ball with you, Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis said, two can play at that game. And what Saudi Arabia did over the weekend is it basically said, not only are we not cutting the amount of oil we're producing in order to keep prices up, we are increasing production and slashing prices. Hey, China, you want to buy cheap oil? We've got it. And the beauty with Saudi Arabia is that it costs the Saudis to bring a gallon out of the ground. It costs them $2.80. In other words, almost nothing. And they can then sell it even at these depressed prices at $30. That's not a gallon, it's a barrel or whatever, right? But you get the point. The Saudi profit margin is massive. Russia's profit margin, not so big. Shale in Texas profit margin, not large at all. As prices tumble, the Saudis are still okay. We'll get to why they're not really okay. But they're still okay from an oil perspective. Russia struggles. Russia really struggles, and Russia's a poor country in real terms. And it struggles. It gets all its income from energy, and that income is going to come down dramatically as oil prices come down, and they have already come down dramatically. And shale oil struggles. Texas struggles. And you saw today, energy prices have been weak all year, but they came down dramatically today. Any business related to shale oil tumbled today. Banks, Texas banks, went down 25% in one day. 25% stock prices went down in one day. So here we have oil prices tumbling. Now, one could make the argument that oil prices going down is a good thing. For certain sectors in the economy, for certain people in the economy, absolutely. The cost of energy is going to go down. The cost of driving your car is going to go down because oil has come down to historic lows at $30 a barrel. It's really, really low. And yet, the market's response to oil price coming down is being dramatically negative, and for, I think, two reasons. One, oil prices coming down is a reflection of a lack of demand for oil, which is a reflection of the slowing global economy. And second, there's a lot of industries that are important that are going to suffer because of because of oil prices coming down, particularly oil, shale, and everything related to that. And so much of the U.S. economy now is dependent on shale that it has an impact. Now, I think it's overplayed. I think in the end, the benefits of cheap oil outweigh the costs of cheap oil. I think overall, cheap oil is good for the U.S. economy. It's good for manufacturing. It's good for transportation. It's good for much of the economy. And I think that the Saudis, if you had to see who are the biggest beneficiaries of what the Saudis just did in lowering the price of oil dramatically and increasing the supply of oil dramatically, the biggest beneficiary is China. China buys most of its oil from Saudi Arabia, and China uses that oil to produce energy, to run an industrial society. I think we all benefit when China benefits in the sense that China can then ramp up production, lower prices. If Trump really wanted to help the U.S. economy right now, he would lower tariffs with China to zero unilaterally. That would be the best thing. Lower tariffs on steel from any place in the world down to zero. Lower tariffs generally across the board to zero, but certainly of Chinese goods down to zero, so that both encourages the Chinese economy to recover from the damage of the coronavirus, a recovery that would help the whole global economy. It would then increase the supply of goods into the United States, which would be a boom to the U.S. economy. It would increase the supply of things like steel and other things that you would lower tariffs on, that would then be very beneficial to steel producing industries. So right now, the best thing we can do is not a payroll tax cut. It's not a bailout of any industries. It's actually reversing all the tariffs that Trump has put on China and other countries, particularly South Korea and Japan. All the tariffs that are being imposed on these countries, Canada, Brazil, they should all be lowered, ideally to zero, but at least to what their previous levels were. And you'd see a big rebound in the global economy. But the chances of that happening, unfortunately, are ridiculously low. Instead, we want the Fed to inject more money. We want lower interest rates. We want negative interest rates. Trump would love negative interest rates. He said so on many occasions. And we want bailouts across the board of industries, of states, of whole economies. And of course, the next is that, I hope this doesn't get to it, but I hope we don't get to the point where we're bailing out the shale industry because oil prices are so low. I don't think that'll come to it. I think there's plenty of players with money who can continue to finance the shale business to the point where oil prices either come up or where marginal cost of producing shale drops. But oil plummeted today in terms of oil prices, again, because of the Saudi-Russian disagreement and the Saudis' commitment to pump oil, huge quantities of oil, into the market at lower and lower and lower prices. So a lot of stuff happening right now economically, and unfortunately, I think what really scares markets is the mismanagement. I've argued often that what really caused the 2008 recession to become a great recession, to become a disaster, to become as bad as it did, was not the state of banks, was not the state of mortgages, was not financial markets. It was politicians. It was the panic of the Bush administration, the panic at the Federal Reserve. It was the Federal Reserve doing stupid things and wrong things. It was Bernanke, Paulson, and Bush that turned a bad recession into the Great Recession, a stock market collapse into a stock market disaster. And I fear that the combination of Trump and the Democrats, where everything today is politicized, everything now is tribal, everything now is about re-election or getting elected, that our politicians are going to be the ones who take us into a healthcare crisis that they turn into a healthy disaster. I think that's certainly what's happening in Italy. We had a healthcare crisis being turned into an economic disaster that's not going to mitigate the crisis, but it is going to cause a massive economic crisis in a country that can't afford one, because the Italian economy is already in shambles. They're basically killing it now. Just get out of the way. Get out of the way. Private markets know how to handle these things. You know, again, the government has a role. Defining its exact role is tricky, but it's certainly they are overreacting. Today, if you look at all across all government, and they're giving bad advice, wrong advice, and politicizing everything. All right, let's see if there's any related Super Chat questions. Paul Krugman just wrote an article arguing permanent government stimulus exceeding 200% of GDP, like Japan's model. I mean, he's really losing it, and he's trying to compete with their modern monetary theory, which says you should just print money like crazy. Now, he doesn't believe in modern monetary theory, so he has to come up with other ways to justify massive spending. But of course, what is the Japan model's results? Basically, zero economic growth. About 4 recessions since 2008. Ongoing stimulus with shock. No results. Nothing. I mean, I think it was Einstein. Maybe it wasn't Einstein. Somebody said, repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Over and over again, when it has the same result over and over again. But this time it's going to have different results. Is madness. It is insanity. And yet our politicians and our economic pundits, not just Paul Krugman, but across the board, lower interest rates, lower. Look how well it's worked in Europe. Europe has negative interest rates and they're booming, right? No. They're on the verge of collapse. They're on the verge of recession. They've got massive malinvestment. Their banking system is basically bankrupt. So, President Trump, you want the Fed to do the same in America? It's worked so badly in Europe, you want it to work as badly here? Or Paul Krugman, stimulus, which, by the way, Trump is talking about stimulus as well. Stimulus through a payroll cut or stimulus through an infrastructure project, infrastructure spending. Stimulus. The Japanese have been trying these stimulus all the time with negative results. But this time it'll work. And by the way, we tried stimulus, the Obama stimulus, the Bush stimulus before Obama. None of them worked, but this time we'll get it right. Exponential virus slowing it for preparation. Maybe, but by what right does government have to violate rights on a massive scale in order to slow a virus that is not that deadly? I just don't get it. In order to prepare, when it's not even the government's job in many cases to prepare. Now, it is today because the government is basically monopolizing disaster preparedness. But it shouldn't be. In a rational world, hospitals would have noticed what is going on in China. Others in the field would have noticed. They would be rushing vaccines. They were working like crazy on them. They'd be rushing and focusing on testing. And they'd be stocking up on supplies and maybe even some temporary hospital tents or whatever in order to deal with it when it came to the United States, and insurance companies would be supporting that. But instead, we've got the government monopolizing this and not doing its job on the crucial element, which is where it truly is deadly. And figuring out where it's truly deadly and figuring out what its role is. And I think in this case, its role is primarily information. Information. And making sure that the tests may be up to standards. But primarily, it's information. Not quarantine people because it's not Ebola. It's not the kind of disease where, or even MERS, which is the Middle Eastern version, where people die, large numbers. And I don't see the preparation. You would have a case to say, okay, we canceled all those flights and we prepared. We canceled all the flights and we didn't prepare because we thought, our government thought, our president thought that that was enough. And that is insanity. What would Midas Mulligan do? I don't know. About what? About this? Well, I mean, he would argue against the Federal Reserve. He would argue against the actions of the Federal Reserve. He'd argue against government intervention in the economy. And he would argue for people dealing with it as individuals, as companies, as businesses. And he would argue that the government's job should be limited to the protection of rights. And it's tricky in this situation to figure out what exactly that means. How do you protect rights here and not overreact? Linus Pauling said if everyone in quarantine for a week, cold and flu viruses would become permanently extinct. I doubt that, and you'd have new viruses coming in. So I don't know if that's true, but yeah, I mean, when men were quarantined, then they never left their home. The cases of rape would drop dramatically. Men commit most rapes. I think that's pretty acknowledged, right? Almost all of them. If you didn't allow men out of the home, then they wouldn't have opportunity to rape, and they wouldn't rape, and therefore rape would go down. Yeah, I mean, we could do all kinds of things. We could, to stop things we don't like. But that's not freedom. It's not the world we live in. It's not right. It's not just. Just because you're human doesn't mean, government is involved. Government is involved when you're a risk to others. But I'm not a risk to others if I don't have coronavirus. But they want to limit what I do and what business decisions I make and who I interact with, even though I don't have a virus yet. But I doubt that a week would get rid of all the flu and viruses. And again, new viruses would come about. Why not let them lobby our interest in my mind? I don't know what you mean by let them lobby. I have no idea. With around half hospital visits being for emergencies, do you think charity will cover the cost of treating before payment is issued? Well, I think half hospital visits are emergencies because people use emergency rooms as their primary care physician. And that has to do with the fact that too many people are uninsured in this country. And the reason so many people are uninsured, is because we've screwed up in the government intervention into the healthcare system. So if people had insurance, And they could go see a doctor, or they could go see clinics. Walmart is opening up clinics all over the world. And, people would go to clinics. They wouldn't, in a free market in healthcare, you would experience unbelievable innovation in how people are treated, both for emergencies and for day-to-day ills, because there would be a profit incentive to do so. Somebody says, I know better than top immunologists of the world. I've interviewed one of the top immunologists in the world here on this show, and I think he agrees with me. Or I agree with him, because you're right. But top immunologists in the world don't know or don't consider necessarily, with the exception of Amesh, individual rights. And yeah, we could force people to do a lot of things that would reduce disease. We'd stop people eating sugar. We could force people to exercise. We could force people to take vitamin C if vitamin C is good. I don't know if it is. We could put everybody in isolation for a week and cure the common cold. But there's an issue of rights. There's an issue of the role of government. There's an issue of not right or wrong, which has nothing to do with immunology. But in terms of what I say about immunology, I try to stick to what I've learned from people who know. I might be wrong. I'm not an expert in immunology. You guys make sense of this, but I've been reading a lot about this coronavirus, and it seems pretty straightforward. Let's see. Oh my God, did Ayn Rand speak against Saudi Arabia getting technology for drilling oil? I only caught it on one past interview question she had. Ayn Rand spoke against Saudi Arabia getting control over the oil. She spoke against Saudi Arabia nationalizing oil that had been found, developed by foreign companies, by European and American companies. And she believed that oil belonged to the companies who found it, not to the king of Saudi Arabia, not to the state. And that when they nationalized it, that was a travesty, a violation of property rights, and they should not have been allowed to do it. And that Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia, doesn't own the oil in Saudi Arabia. The oil in Saudi Arabia is owned by those who discovered it. And since there are no property rights in Saudi Arabia, the land on which it was discovered did not belong to anybody, and therefore the oil company, but on the principle of if you use it, it's yours, owned the land as well. And when it was taken from those oil companies by the Saudi states, the Iranian state, different countries did it in different times, that was a massive violation of property rights, and the U.S. should have stood up against them. That is what Ayn Rand was talking about. Okay, a few other unrelated questions. Is evil just a mask hiding people's pain? Is everyone's good deep down, or are some people just pure evil to their core, no good in them? Well, but I don't know what you mean by good in them, evil in them. Good and evil are the actions of the mind, right, that they take. And there are people who are evil sometimes, and in other words, they evade, and they might act on that evasion and do horrible things sometimes, but not always. And then there are people who evade constantly, but you couldn't evade constantly. If you evaded constantly, you would be dead. So even people who are evil have to use some bit of reason and rationality in order to survive. And indeed, most of the time, what keeps evil people alive and keeps them going, keeps them functioning, is the support of non-evil people. It's the sanction of the victim. So evil is not just a mask hiding people's pain. I mean, people who are evil are often people who feel pain, often people who psychologically are damaged, who, evading reality causes bad outcomes, and those bad outcomes feed on a bad sense of the world and a hatred, and that hatred causes them to commit more vile, evil things, which creates the cycle of evasion and hatred and nihilism. But it's not just a mask. And lots of people have pain and don't resort to evil. Evil is a choice. Evil is a choice some people make. to not deal with reality, to not focus their minds, to not care about consequences, to not care about reality. That's the essence of evil, is evasion. It's negation of the reasoning mind. And that is a choice people make. And some people do it all the time, and you can say they're evil to the core. And some people just do it some of the time, and it's pretty benign in terms of its effect on other people. It's still evil because it's still destroying their own life. And you wouldn't say they're evil to the core, but they're still evil. Should oil companies in Saudi Arabia have pulled an Ellis Wyatt as a last resort in response to the nationalization? Well, I mean, I don't know. You know, the fires would have been put out. Oil fires can be put out, and then the companies would have taken over those oil fields. Saudi Arabia would have taken the oil fields anyway. No, I think it was the job of the American government, given the magnitude of the resource, given the magnitude of the investment, given the significance of oil companies. It was part of the job of the American government to defend those property rights and to use both political, but if necessary, even military means in order to stop the nationalization. And it could have been done very, very easily at the time. Very, very easily at the time. It's the more Saudi Arabia has gotten oil, the more weapons it has, the more political power it has, the more persuasion it has in the world, the more difficult it is to rein them in. But at the time, they were nothing. And they could have easily been stopped from nationalizing the oil. Does crack have a role in achieving happiness? No. It actually has a role in defeating your attempt to achieve happiness. Drugs generally that mess up with your mind, that mess up with your ability to reason and be rational, don't have any role in the achievement of happiness. On the contrary, they undercut your ability to be happy, particularly when they're addictive. And therefore you become dependent on them rather than focusing on reality. You're focused now on the crack, on the high, on the pleasure, on the momentary pleasure. Hedonism is not achieving happiness. Achieving a high is not achieving happiness. Achieving happiness is achieved, and happiness is this long-term, pervading sense of joy in the world, of belonging in the world, of loving your life in this world. That's what happiness is. And happiness is achieved by achieving your values. Happiness is achieved by engaging with the world with your full faculty of reason and achieving those values and seeing the impact that you can have in the world and on the creation of values. That's what happiness comes from. It doesn't come from getting a high on crack. Can you talk about worldwide citizenship taxation? Yes, I mean, there's definitely a movement to try to, well, in the United States, you're taxed on your worldwide income, which is a massive, horrific thing that almost no other country has. If crack cannot be your value, because crack is anti-life, so values are only pro-life. Values, in the moral sense, only pro-life. If crack is your value, then life is not your value, and therefore you are committing suicide, and you're on the track to commit suicide. You're not pursuing morality. You're pursuing pleasure with the goal of death. So taxing worldwide income is evil enough, but the goal of the UN and the goal of, I think, many multinational institutions is to establish a tax system that is global so that you can't evade taxes in one country by moving to another, that you're taxed everywhere and you're taxed equally everywhere. And ultimately this leads to world government. And it is horrific. It is another form of statism, a horrific form of statism, because it doesn't allow you escape. It doesn't allow you change options. It doesn't allow you to leave. It doesn't allow you to switch jurisdictions. It doesn't allow for competition between governments. So world government, any form of world government, is a disaster, and any form of coordination among governments over something immoral like coercive taxation is a disaster. It's evil, it's wrong, it's a violation of rights, and it's economically horrific. But more importantly, it's a horrible violation of your property rights and your right to your life and the products of your life. All right, we are going to call it a day. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully this has been of benefit to you. Don't panic. I mean, the only reason to panic is over the response, not over the disease itself. So worry about the response. Worry about what our politicians are doing. Worry about your neighbors who are panicking. Don't panic about the disease itself. Worry, and in any case, don't panic. Just think it through. Use your mind, use reason, think rationally, logically about what you should and shouldn't do, how to behave, and how to cope with a very, very bad situation being inflicted on us by our neighbors and our politicians. All right, I will talk to you soon, I guess. Not sure exactly when. I had to cancel one of my trips. I was going to fly tomorrow, but I canceled it because when I was going to Chicago and I had a bunch of meetings lined up and nobody wanted to meet me face to face. They all canceled meetings. This is part of this panicky thing. And some of the companies I was going to visit told their workers to stay home and not to come into work, so couldn't meet them. So I'm doing phone calls instead. So I'll probably do another show this week, maybe Wednesday, and then I am on the road. I will be traveling. I will be, by the way, ARI is holding its conference in Philadelphia on Saturday. I hope you come from New York, come from Baltimore and D.C., make this a real East Coast event. It's going to be a lot of fun. It'll be a whole day. I'll be there for the whole day. We'll be talking about a lot of different things. There'll be a good group of us there, a big group of us. Don't let the coronavirus stop you from coming and enjoying the company of other objectivists. And I'll be there. Love to meet you all. Maybe we won't shake hands. We'll bump whatever. And I'll also be in Denver at the Leadership Program of the Rockies on Friday. Quick question I got here. How can we separate taxes from individuals in the sense that we want to volunteer to what we want to cancel? I don't understand the question. So, I mean, ultimately, taxes should be voluntary. Revenue to the government should be voluntary, and you as an individual should write a check. And if you want to pay today more taxes because something, I don't quite understand the question. So maybe tomorrow or next show, or send me an email with the question better articulated so I can understand what exactly you mean. We can't separate taxes from individuals. Only individuals pay taxes. Even corporate taxes are paid by individuals. That is a life goal for me to go to. Okay. All right. I hope to see you in Philadelphia or in Denver or somewhere else. What does Rand have why doesn't Rand have LGBT characters? Why should she? She was writing in 1957. LGBT wasn't a thing back then. But why should she? I don't get why you have to have LGBT characters in anything. What's the point, right? She had generally a negative view of LGBT, I guess. But even if she didn't, why would you have? I read a novel. I don't think, do they have every whatever? I mean, that's ridiculous, right? You have the characters you can relate to. You have the characters you respond to. You have the characters you want to say something about. She had nothing. There's no purpose to bring an LGBT into her novels. For her. You want to write a novel with LGBT characters? Go for it. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week. Don't panic. And don't forget to like, share, and support the show. Yaron Brook, show.com/support. I got an okay boomer. I must be doing something right. Bye.